Good day, family and friends, and everyone concerned. Hope you're all well. My name is Desire Pepe. Today, I'll be talking, about the patriotics, children, oftentimes, I encounter, parents, insulting their children, you hear them, calling their children names, you stupid, you big-headed, you ugly, you this and that, the space, parents, speaking disparagingly, with their children, parents are to exhort on you that you're not supposed to say such words, it's all bad, all those invasive words, they are not good for your children, as you know it, our words, they build and they also break, and a child, especially when he's young, it's malleable, get a child, gets programmed, with this environment, and you're not supposed, to build up a child, who's going to be, having low self-esteem, lacking confidence when he grows, of course, I know you want a child, that's going to grow up, confident and brilliant and excellent also, and research, you have to start, from while a child is still young, as our, in my home language, it's in David Nguni, they say is semanzi, meaning a child, it gets molded while he's young, and I know, of course, children, might get, peer pressured, school and playing places, they might get, some of those bad, behaviors, and influences, you might find a child, comes at home and starts swearing, instead of, as it were, insulting that child, you might use, wise words, you might use, itchy words like that. Yes, and you might use, words, circumspectly, considerating for the child, you might use words especially when a child maybe, swears, you might use words what child, you are not supposed to swear, swearing is for losers, and you are not a loser, you are on the winning part, and with such, it sits well, with the child, and you, in fact, you want a child, to grow up, able, to think for him or herself, you have to build the child like that, give him, that independent mindset, whereby, you help him or her, to think for herself, as it were, and yes, otherwise that's it, family. Otherwise, thank you. God bless. Goodbye.